Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our Harbor Online Community YouTube channel, where we do a little recap of our Thursday night gatherings. We are right now in a series on the book of Acts and learning some of the really exciting stories of the early church. And it reads a bit like an adventure story, the adventures of Peter and the adventures of Paul. And so last night we talked about a very quite exciting story. And Dottie, why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. This is our second week talking about Acts, and John shared we're using this commentary, and it is by Willie Jennings, and he's just an awesome scholar and quite intense and heady and provocative, and we're doing it. We are putting on the Willie Jennings hat as best as we can and trying to understand Acts through his scholarship. So we looked at Acts 5, 1 through 11. And this is a story that is just bizarre. It is so weird. And last night we definitely felt how weird this story was. So a couple in the thing about this early church is that this community had committed to sharing belongings with one another. They were like, this is us being in a radical community. And Willie Jennings calls it, this is revolutionary. The way that people are belonging to one another is very intimate and it's very revolutionary. So by the time we get to Acts 5, that standard of intense communalism is already set. And Acts 5 tells this story of a couple in the community who sold their house, kept some of the profits for themselves, and then lied about how much they were giving to the community. Told the community they gave everything, really they're keeping some for themselves. Now, for many of us, we're like, that's fine. That's all right. But in this story, Peter is like, why did you lie? You didn't give us everything. And they drop dead. And it is like so weird. So we did talk about the violence in the text that according to Willie Jennings, this is not a text condoning violence, right? This is not what the heart of the text is about. And anytime we approach a violent text at Harbor, a lot of times we take on the lens of what is the author trying to say rather than God is condoning violence, right? Violence is not in how we understand God, violence is not a part of God's vision for us or desire for us. So we talked about the violence and how it's just like, what in the world? Why would they die? This is so weird. And then we talked about this really provocative take that Willie Jennings has, and that is that it is the unit, the coupling, that is problematic. It's not these individuals making a decision, but it's this couple prioritizing themselves above the community, and not abiding by the community guidelines. That is problematic. And Jennings' take is the church has actually really focused, almost obsessed over being married is the end goal. But really, there's more going on. And he has this quote that this story is about the married couple learning the community doesn't belong to them, they belong to the community. And yeah, and Jennings' take is really hot and really critical of modern day coupling and the church's interpretation of coupling, and basically saying that, hey, there's other ways of belonging. There's other ways of intimacy beyond this romantic couple. And this couple, by lying about what they gave and what they didn't, were putting themselves in a sovereign position over the community. And that's just not the case. So Dawn, what were people talking about in your discussion room?
Well, Dottie, as you know, we have a little running joke at Harbor that we are constantly reminding each other that we are not a cult. And there's some seriousness to that because we're online. You know, sometimes people, like someone says, I'm part of an online church, and their loved ones might be like, but how do I know this is healthy for you? Like, I don't see a church sign. I don't like, I can't, you know. So like, it's a fair question. And so we talk about why that's not the case. We don't have the expectations of people anyway, but we do have this running joke about whether or not we're a cult. So of course, that's where we went first and foremost, was like, wow, this sounds kind of culty. Being part of a community where you give everything that is yours into what is common, and then if you don't, you die. Like, you know, that's a little hard to hear post like some of the real tragedies we've had in the 20th century. So, and also all of those communities that kind of started with a good, you know, start with really good intentions, some of them. So we just kind of named that and said, this is weird. But there is something really beautiful, both about, I mean, about that kind of, because they're both a commitment, right? That commitment to being married, but ultimately that commitment in community, and how like we'd love to see that kind of commitment and be part of a community that has that kind of commitment with one another. And how, you know, for many people, that's a need to be able to be part of a community that will take care of one another, that might share property, that might um, sign off, you know, an emergent, you know, be my emergency contact because, you know, I don't have a spouse to do this for me. Um, and so I think it really gave us a bit of an aspirational idea of what community could look like, which was a lovely way to enter into that story, into a very weird story. How about you?
Yeah, we also began our discussion talking about this is weird. Is this a cult? And I was just kind of cracking up because I was so in the weeds of Jennings scholarship that I really was like, oh, yeah, this is really weird. Right? I was more like in the weeds. He's kind of writes very poetically. So I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. But didn't necessarily like just zoom back and have yeah, so it was very helpful to hear people's first reaction of like, what in the world? This is such a weird story. It sounds like a cult. This is not okay. This married couple didn't do anything wrong, blah, blah, blah. So we had a lot of kickback. And then we talked about, okay, what is the heart of this book, the book of Acts, and the heart of Jennings' interpretation of Acts is not a cult. It's not violence. It's not necessarily that married couples are the problem, whatever. The heart is to belong to one another, and that the church is showing an image of how to belong in a way that's up against empire and up against power and uniting people as they experience diaspora, right? So like there's so much goodness that is happening in the sense of belonging that it's almost a disservice that we have these weird stories because it's like it's just a little jagged. But the heart of it is okay, and not to excuse or justify how weird this text is. It's weird. It's good that we're wrestling. And the heart of it is, what does it mean to belong to one another in a very, very revolutionary way against empire? And our group talked about, is this something realistic? And what do we envision a healthy community of belonging is? And we had several people that said, I want this. Like, I want to, not in a cult way, but I want this. A lot of people said, I've experienced this at Harbor. Like, I have experienced being held and known by this community and this community showing up for me. But in a practical sense, some people were like, I wish I lived in a community like this and knew that I was going to get a ride somewhere because they're not able to drive. And another person said, I've never been in a couple, and I wish that married couples in my experience of church ministry weren't above me. And Yeah, there's just a lot of different perspectives, and I think it was good for us to kind of wrestle with how do we foster really amazing belonging in church and in our neighborhoods, and ask of ourselves, like, what commitments do we have within us and what's healthy, and how do we shift away from individualism to communalism, and also not go too radical in it too. So it was just like so much back and forth, but really good conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, it was so good, and some really tender moments too, as we talked about belonging and mutual care, too. That is just so much a part of that way of being. Um, I love that we're ending on belonging. I think that's a great way for us to end. And so thank you for your present for your content last night. Clearly very engaging, and we love diving into the weird at Harbor. We're not afraid of it. We just jump right in because we're a little weird ourselves, but not a cult.
Not a cult.
Not a cult.